Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the organising committee, particularly Room, Marco, Carsten and Vivian, for the invitation to come here and for helping in a number of different ways. I'm pretty used to this sort of thing. I feel very odd. I haven't given a lecture since I retired over 11 years ago. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to be very quick with the slides. Don't worry too much about that. Some of them I'm going to ignore, I hope, as we're going through. Where it's important, I'll try and take a bit longer. The title should really be An Old Question, Old Data by an Old Man. The old question has to do with handedness and reading ability. There's been a lot of work in the last century, but the conclusions for most of the work are pretty inconsistent. One of the ways in which people have looked at the relationship between handedness and reading is to take groups of handedness and compare reading scores. But there are other ways of doing it, and what we wanted to do was to look at handedness within groups of so-called dyslexic people. The data are well over 20 years old. It's the pandemic that gave me the opportunity to have a look at it for coming here. And my then postgraduate Karen collected data from nearly 1,000 people, but in those days one lost data a lot from computer transfer, and we've been left with rather fewer, but still we have a sample size of 533, and their ages run from 7 years, 8 months to 11 years, 3 months. So our measures were transferred or translated into age-related Z scores. Our measure of reading was the British Ability Scale, which can give you a reading age in months. Now, if you take the reading age in months and you subtract chronological age, if they're equivalent, you'll get a value of 0, of course. If it's positive, then you're a good reader for your age. If it's negative, then you're a relatively poor reader for your age. And we're going to use, or I'm going to use, the term dyslexic just for the sake of consistency with other papers I'm going to talk about. This is a distribution of that difference that I was talking about, BAS minus CA. And when I talk about poor readers, I'm going to be talking about sections of this bottom part of the distribution. We used the Annette Handedness questionnaire to measure hand preference. And I'm going to be talking only about the item that gives us the hand used for reading, wherever it is. But we did do much more sophisticated analyses using Annette's form of analysis, which most people don't. But it didn't give us any different data, so I'm not going to mention it. We also used the peg moving task to derive a laterality index. The peg moving task gives you a score in terms of time taken by the left hand and the right hand, and you can take a difference. So most people are faster with the right hand, so a left minus right difference gives you a positive score. You can work out a laterality index, and we did this in the usual sort of way. This is pretty unusual. It certainly was unusual for 20 odd years ago when the data were collected. So here are the data for our so-called dyslexic people. What we did was to divide that distribution I showed you, the BAS minus CA, into 2 different levels. Keep on doing this the wrong way. We have a group that refers to the lowest 20% of reading ability and a group that refers to the lowest 10%. And what we did was we looked at the numbers of left and right handers within each of these groups, and the answer is there is no difference, no association of handedness with group. And that's a pretty common finding in the literature. I've got chi-squares there and so forth. There are no more p-values to come because they're all round about p.896 or something. You don't want to see those. So no effect so far. Now, Marie-Nanette suggested in 2011 that one of the problems with the way of doing research so far had been that people did not look at different kinds of dyslexia. The two types that I'm particularly interested in, or have been in a different context actually, were phonological and surface dyslexia. Phonological dyslexics have difficulty with reading irregular words. Sorry, other way around. They can read irregular words, key, pint, kernel, height, weight, and so forth, because they're using supposedly a whole word root to read, but they have difficulty with non-words because they can't do the grapheme to phoneme correspondence. Surface dyslexics are rather the other way around. These are explained very easily on a dual root model of reading. You don't have to look at it. All it is that, oops. Doesn't seem to want to go back. All right, is that the dual root model suggests that there are two roots, one for analyzing in terms of sound or phonics, if you like, and another for looking at whole words. Well, I published a book on dyslexia a long time ago now, 2004, but the publishers, for some reason or another, want to open it up and reissue it. So, as they usually do, they sent round a proposal to their readers asking for opinions. Why is it not going forward? What button do I press to get it go forward if I don't use this? This arrow downward or that one? That one? Does that put it on?
The whole thing seems to have stopped. Huh? Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right, but that's the one I wanted to show anyway, that particular slide.
Okay.
Right. The readers came back and said that topics that were relevant at the time when I published the book in 2004 seem less relevant now, and in particular, attempts to identify subtypes of developmental dyslexia and the importance of handedness, laterality, the right shift theory. So they were saying, chuck it out, it's old hat, more old hat. Well, that's bad news for me because, to be honest, the only parts of dyslexia I'm now interested in are those to do with laterality and, well, to do with laterality, basically. Well, going back to Marion, she died a few years ago, and some of you might have read the obituary that Chris McManus, myself, and Mike Corbalis wrote for laterality. She has this theory, this right shift theory. I'm sure most of you know about it, but basically she argues that there is a single gene, and I know that nobody believes that now, but she reckons that there is, or reckoned that there was a single gene that pushed the distribution of hand differences towards the right. So this is what we might call the laterality distribution, where your left hand is better here, your right hand is better there. Better means faster in terms of our analyses. She argued that it was a right shift because it was the whole distribution was shifted to the right in humans relative to the assumed distribution for non-human animals. Now, I can't go into in any detail, but this single gene she talked about, her right shift gene, gives rise to 3 genotypes, RS minus minus, RS plus plus, and the heterozygote RS plus minus. All you need to know here is that the RS minus minus people she reckoned are not good at phonological tasks. They lack her right shift gene that supposedly puts everything into the left hemisphere and gives some advantage to learning language. On the other hand, literally on the other hand, the RS++ people up at the end here are very good at language tasks, so she says, but were expected to be less good on visuospatial tasks. And the genotypes, 3 genotypes, are underneath the distribution that we looked at earlier. So this curve here is the one we just seen. So she carried out an experiment in 1996 with colleagues, and it was that experiment that we wanted to replicate. The main purpose for experiment was to test her hypothesis that dyslexics with poor phonology, that is, phonological dyslexics, would lack the typical bias to dextrality that is in the normal population, while other dyslexics are strongly dextral. She and we administered the same tests as far as we could, not word reading, non-word reading, phoneme deletion. Take a word like strip, ask somebody to say what's strip without the s, and it's obviously trip, and what's trip without the t, it's rip. And in children, that predicts their reading ability. And she had a test of word order memory that I won't bother going into, but was another phonological test. So we had outcome measures on these standardized for age. So remember the prediction, phonological dyslexics are likely to be less right-handed, in other words, more left-handed than controls. What we did in looking at everything was the same thing. We looked at either the bottom 20% of this distribution of BAS minus CA, and we looked at the bottom 10%. We also looked at the distribution on our phonological measures, and we had 2 measures there, or 2 levels, minus 1.3Z, minus 1.5Z. We looked at the number of left and right handers, and we looked at the laterality index. So that was what we did for all the analyses. And this is what we got. This is comparing phonological dyslexics with the remaining non-phonological dyslexics and controls. Look at the number of left and right handers, and we've got 5 left, for example, here, 32 there, 121. These are on different measures of word processing that I just mentioned a minute ago, and that's a combined measure. And all you need to take away from this is, guess what? Nothing significant at all. Oh yeah, that was same again, but we had the previous slide was on the minus 1.3Z cutoff for phonological ability. This was at minus 1.5. Looking at the laterality index, rather than hand preference, it looks very complicated, but again, the take-home message is that on our lax criterion, minus 1.3, we get no effect of the LI. And similarly, in fact, for the strict criterion. So we can conclude by saying that there's no association of type of dyslexia with either hand preference or relative hand skill. The prediction was not satisfied. In fact, in many respects, it went the opposite way around. Now, I won't go into the slides that I've got. I'll simply say, we then try to define surface dyslexics, those people who have difficulty in reading whole words. And so we had phonological dyslexics, the surface dyslexics, other what we called, and the literature tends to refer to as garden variety dyslexics, and normal controls, and there was no difference whatsoever. So there was nothing from Annette's predictions based on her right shift theory to suggest that looking at different kinds of dyslexia is going to solve that problem of the relationship between handedness and dyslexia. And we also looked at IQ scores because she published something on a paper called The Disadvantages of Dexterity for Intelligence. Guess what? Again, absolutely nothing. So the take-home message is maybe the readers who the publishers employed to look at my book and decide whether it ought to be published in the same kind of format, maybe they were right. Maybe the right shift theory hasn't got a lot more to say now after all, which would be a great pity because I've actually been something of a proselytizer for Marion. But I'm sure if Chris is here, he'd be quite glad to know that, well, it didn't come up with the goods. So thanks very much for your attention. And in particular, thank you to the committee.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, I think sometime in the 90s, there was a paper from Kenneth's lab that showed that for the relation of dyslexia and dichotic listening performance, the symptom strength was very important. So if they looked at like dyslexic kids that didn't have like a lot of symptoms that responded well to therapy, they wouldn't find anything with dichotic listening, which I guess was a bit closer to the neurobiology of dyslexia and handedness. But they found stronger and significant effect if they looked at dyslexic that had like more severe symptoms. So I was wondering if you had any measure of how strongly individual participants were affected by dyslexia, whether this might be something that may be more interesting than looking at subforms of dyslexia.
Right. Well, what I've called dyslexics for consistency with Annette's paper may well not be dyslexic by some other criterion. They're just simply poor readers relative to their age. And it's precisely because of your question that we looked at two different levels of poor reading. Some were, even more behind their chronological age than others, and we got the same findings. But an interesting question, sir.
Thank you, and it's really following on what Sebastian said, because we have a study that you are reviewer of that looking at the.
Not only am I old, I'm going deaf.
But one in the room, and it's really on looking at the severity level. So we try to be very, and with the same approach, comparing this dyslexic group and controls and measuring left and frequency in these two groups. We do see an effect, but we see it when we are really consistent in how we define the initial groups and based on the severity criteria. So then one of the reviewers pointed out that it's important to consider IQ means frequency in how we define our group, and that's when it becomes questionable. Because in our experience, when we use IQ discrepancy, what you end up finding is that there are people who have very high IQ, but in the normal range. And then are these dyslexic? Maybe not. So my question, I'm making it very long, but my question was, when you consider IQ, I was curious what you actually used, was the discrepancy or was some other?
No, we didn't use a discrepancy definition because it's coming. It is becoming, or seems to be becoming more clear in the literature, which I last looked at quite a long time ago, I must admit, that IQ is irrelevant to a definition. Now, if you've got anything to do with the dyslexia field, you'll find that the same old arguments have been going on for virtually 100 years. The first paper on dyslexia by 1898, I think it was, Pringle Morgan, pointed out that his patient, can't remember his name, was of a very high IQ, but couldn't read very well. And ever since then, people have argued, does it matter? Well, the fact is, of course, you can have people who are very bright, who have difficulty in learning to read. And of course, you can have people who are not so bright having difficulty, but they tend to be a bit ignored because people don't think it's going to matter terribly much for them. They're not going to be writing big PhD theses or something. So we didn't use a discrepancy definition. What I will say is that in Marianne's paper, her definition was the same as ours, and actually it mapped onto a discrepancy definition perfectly well. Yeah, she used a regression approach.
Kenneth.
Thank you, Alan. Very interesting to hear some more data. I think that the distinction between poor readers and dyslexic readers, call it like that, where we would need longitudinal data for that, because poor readers may be a developmental lag effects and they may catch up over time. So cross-sectional data may actually miss that poor readers may not be dyslexic in the sense that they develop. But dyslexia to me is a diagnosis in a way. It shouldn't go away developmentally to the same degree, at least.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Ken. I've lost my drift now. It's these, that's what's doing it, I think. I think one of the problems with dyslexia is how do you define it? Now, personally, if I see people, I can sometimes guess that they're dyslexic because you can have a kind of clinical diagnosis or classification where people are not just having difficulty in learning to read, but they have a number of associated symptoms, sometimes to do with motor function or whatever, right? Now, you don't get comparisons of straight, what you might call statistical dyslexics with clinically defined dyslexics. The two fields, in fact, tend to work in entirely separate ways. And one of the problems with people working with clinic type dyslexics is that they're often referred to a clinic, guess what? Because they're left-handed. So when they're counted, you end up with more left-handers. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, thank you very, very much, Alan.
Well, thank you.